Please welcome Ian Bushfield.
Alright. Well, this will be sort of informal, and I apologize in advance. I'm fighting off a cold, so if I pass out in the middle of this talk, hi. Grab a seat wherever. It's going to be an informal evening. As I was saying, I'm fighting off a cold, yet that doesn't stop me from drinking. I discovered they have ginger beer on tap, which just sounds like a cold remedy that should be debunked, but shouldn't. Don't debunk it. It's delicious. So my name's Ian. I come from Canada. I got in touch with Chris before I got here, and I knew another Chris for somehow. All the people I knew in Leeds seemed to be named Chris. But I was looking at the September lineup, and it didn't look like Chris had anything lined up for this month. So I offered to step forward, and I blatantly stole the Merseyside Skeptic podcast title, Skeptics with a K, and changed it to Skeptics with an A, and that's where that terrible pun comes from. So I apologize if there's any Liverpudlians here. I did learn that word because I went to Liverpool a couple weekends ago. What I want to talk about is the goal. I want to talk about myself because I'm egotistical apparently. I want to talk about free thought in Canada, I'm going to use terms interchangeably, free thought, humanism, skepticism, because there's enough overlap in those three communities, and we can debate whether or not I should be doing this, but I'm too lazy and sick right now to care. And I'm going to talk about some of the broader issues, and especially contemporary issues, like what's going on in Canada right now that secularists and skeptics are really up in arms about. So to start off, I grew up in southern Alberta, just outside of Calgary on a small farm. For those who don't know, Alberta is the second most western province in Canada. It's sometimes thought of as the Texas of the North. There's pictures of Jesus Land in the US, which is where the most religious states are, and sometimes it includes Alberta, and then the sides are the United States of Kanakistan, and that's where the godless liberals all live, is on the coast. I once heard it said that water attracts atheism and liberalism, so we're not really near a big body of water, so So I grew up in southern Alberta in a very secular family, though. Alberta was about 25% no religion in 2001. It's about 30% now. But it's also got a very strong evangelical movement. It always sort of has. Canada was founded by these two competing narratives of the sort of English settlers bringing Protestantism in and the French Catholics coming in. And we sort of had that fight ongoing and ongoing and ongoing, but now we sort of expanded it to be more multicultural, so we include the First Nations that the British and French and all the other colonialists came in and sort of wiped out, and then we include all the immigrants who've come over since, which is a large number. Canada's a very diverse country these days, and really invented multiculturalism. We can talk about that later, but it's not the focus of tonight. I would argue, although that Canada is the only country that has sort of gotten multiculturalism right, but it was also the one that invented it, so maybe that's why. So I grew up in southern Alberta. My school was public, it was secular, and when I say public, I mean it was state funded, because public here means something it doesn't mean in Canada. So I went to a state public school. Certain provinces in Canada, so Canada, each province funds its education system. Provinces are like Scotland here, where they each have their own legislature. Each province runs their own education system. Alberta runs competing publicly funded, state-funded systems for the public secular students and for Catholics. And the reason for this is that two competing narratives, that French and English history of Canada, and it's the same in Ontario and a few other provinces, where we have two fully funded school boards in every district, one for Catholics and one which for what used to be Protestants but now is secular. A neat quirk of Alberta was, up until a few years ago, there was one district where it was predominantly Catholic, so they had to put in a Protestant separate board, and that was to protect the minority rights there. But then there was one city in there, or town, that didn't have any Protestants apparently, so they never got this separate board. So they only ever had a Catholic school in this one town called, I forget the name, Wayne's right now. So this one town north of Edmonton only ever had Catholic schools. So students in 2011 public school students had to go to Catholic school. They had to pray every morning, they had to do the Lord's Prayer. And this is the only public system they had available to them. So they fought and fought and fought. And the local district was like, oh, there's not enough demand for a secular system in 2011 in this town, come on. But eventually they got it. They did get a secular separate school established. They didn't disestablish the public funding going to this religious school, but they did get their secular school centuries late. So my school in southern Alberta, which is sort of the Bible Belt of Canada, was pretty good. I didn't see much religion in school. The only thing that really twanged my secular head, and I didn't think of myself as a hardcore atheist when I was growing up, we just didn't do religion. I learned about it through The Simpsons, is when I hit Bio 20 or grade 11 bio or high school biology class, and my teacher is getting to the evolution unit, and he gives us this disclaimer. He says, I don't care what your beliefs are. I don't care what you believe at home. You have to learn this, and you have to learn this for the test, if that's all you care about. I was like, why is this one unit getting a disclaimer at the front of the class? And we don't talk about that in front of gravity. And I sort of just put it to the back of my head. It was just this weird one thing that happened in school. So I guess the other issues that sort of came up as I investigated more later in my life about this education system in Canada is Alberta, being the sort of Texas of the North, has still a clause in the school acts permitting religious and patriotic instruction. So they still allow school prayer, and the way they reconcile this with students allowing students not wanting to, with human rights, is to say, well, you can go sit in the hall if you get a note from your parent, if your regressive rural school district still does school prayer, which most don't, but there are a few isolated instances. In every other province in Canada, this has been struck down the courts as unconstitutional and an offense to human rights, because students shouldn't have to sit in the hall in public school while the other students pray to an imaginary god that's not really recognized uniformly. But that hasn't been fought through in Alberta because there's a very strong religious voice, and the atheists tend to be very quiet, not wanting to offend what they view as a very religious area. That's been getting more. I also got Gideon Bibles when I was in grade 5. So this is where they go around in, I guess, grade 5s at most schools and hand out little pamphlets that say, would your student like an answer book? And then when you get that answer book, it turns out to be the New Testament and Psalms, because they don't want to give children the Old Testament. That shit's scary. But they give you the Gideon Bible, and you have to, actually what I got was an opt-out. So you had to sign, you get your parents to sign to say my student would, or my child would not like a Bible. And I remember getting it, and I remember joking on the bus that if I got it, I would burn it. And I don't remember the reaction of my friends, but I think they were like, what? So I was always a bit of a shit. Canada also has a bit of a creationist movement. It's not the same as the States, where it's a battle at every school board, but there are definitely school boards in rural areas of Canada where it comes up that, oh, we shouldn't teach evolution or this or that, and there's fights over it. It was a big fight in rural British Columbia in about the early 2000s or mid-90s, and eventually the government never really wants to step in these cases because they would rather not deal with controversy, just like in the UK. I think they have sort of washed their hands of moral issues because they don't want bad press, and divisive issues are bad press. So, but we eventually won the creationist fight, and by we, I mean people before me who did some amazing skeptical humanist work. So kudos to all of them. That's sort of my childhood. Growing on, I went to university because it seemed like the good idea. And I went to Edmonton because I wanted to get out of Calgary, but I was too lazy to look at how far I could go. And the University of Alberta had a nice engineering program, so I enrolled in that. And engineering seemed like the most interesting thing to do at the time, so I went into that. And after my first year of sort of general engineering, I specialized in engineering physics because that seemed like the least boring of the engineering options and the most sort of sparking my curiosity. In my second year, in 2007, I started reading a lot of blogs on the internet, and that's sort of where I discovered the new atheist movement. And from that, reading people like P.Z. Myers and others, way back in '07. I looked up and there was a group of Edmonton atheists just starting to meet up for about the third month, and I dropped in on their meetup and met some other people there, sort of in an event like this, but everyone spoke the same accent as me, so I wasn't the weirdo. And a few of them were students, and they said, hey, let's start a club. And me being the go-getter I was, I said, sure, let's do this. Let's look up what it takes to start a student group. And we started the University of Alberta Atheists and Agnostics, and we settled on that name because it was the simplest one that we all agreed on. So we founded this student group. We set up a table at the Freshers Week Fair, or the Clubs Fair as we called it there, Week of Welcome. And we sort of just put a big atheist sign up and said, sign here if you want more info about our club and what we're going to do. And we'd been a club for about 2 months at that point, had 2 meetings, and didn't really know what we were going to do. So what we were going to do is what people told us to do. And we had 300 people sign up for more information, just leaving their email. These weren't all members in the end. We didn't have a paid membership, but it was a fantastic turnout. We were just like, because I think in my first year when I'd gone through the clubs fair, I'd gone by Catholic club, Christian club, Korean Christian club, Chinese Christian club, Muslim club, Jewish club, Christian club, Catholic club, second Catholic club. I was like, this is imbalanced. Let's set the alternative and just have some fun and see what it goes to. And so there was this huge outpouring of people who wanted to see sort of a skeptical atheist voice on campus. And we got a lot of profile for it. We got a lot of press because the media loves that sort of controversy that an atheist club automatically brings. The beer actually does help with the cold. One of the big battles we took on at the University of Alberta was the convocation charge. So every student that graduated the U of A had to cross the stage with a speech read out over the announcement that said, use your degree for the glory of God and honor of your country. And this is one that had been written into the university's, sort of founding myth back in 1905, which is not old here, but it's old in Canada, trust me. But we said this doesn't represent every student. There are people who have different concepts of God. There are people who don't believe in God, like our entire club, which has hundreds of members. And so we challenged it and we said, you need to change it, you need to update it. And this all came sort of around the 100-year anniversary of the university, so they made a way bigger deal out of it than they needed to, and the vice president academic who was in charge of this was a very staunch Catholic and had to consult all his religious friends, so it wasn't as easy as just like changing the piece of paper, which is all it really had to do, and it had to go through bureaucratic processes, but we eventually got it changed to, for all who believe to serve your God, you can use your degree, which is an improvement, but it's sort of watered, and it had a few better lines that were actually very humanistic and taken from the founding people of the University of Alberta. Use your degree for the uplifting of the whole spirit or the whole people and things like that. But they kept this little hangover line to sort of appease the president or vice president, and hopefully it'll go away eventually. Around this time when I was involved in Edmonton, I started looking up what the history of the secular movement in Canada was, because I just like reading Wikipedia. It turns out a lot of it was really founded in about the 1950s. And there were sort of 2 groups, one in Victoria in British Columbia on sort of the west coast, and one in Montreal, not on the east coast, but in more eastern Canada in Quebec, where 2 humanist groups formed in just sort of at the 1954 area, sort of for the same purpose, to promote secular humanism, which, then was just humanism. And they got going and attracted members and said, let's provide a non-religious alternative to all the religions we see around. They eventually formed together in the 1960s, especially under the leadership of one man named Henry Morgentaler, who passed away just a few months ago. Henry Morgentaler was a passionate advocate for humanism, actually became one of the most infamous people in Canada, or famous depending on where you sit on the debate. He challenged the abortion law in Canada by performing abortions when it was illegal, and he was arrested multiple times, and juries routinely refused to try him because what they saw him doing was compassion and helping women. And so juries kept refusing to throw him in jail, but the government kept arresting him. So eventually they had to just stop arresting him, and he basically knocked down the first abortion laws by making them ineffective, by showing that the juries, that Canada stopped caring about, obsessing over women's reproductive rights in their first trimester. But that wasn't enough for him. He wanted to get all abortion legalized in Canada, and so he fought all the way until he was arrested again, opening clinics in other provinces, challenging each law, and he eventually fought his way to the Supreme Court and knocked down all laws in Canada because the court ruled that abortion in Canada violated a woman's right to security of person, so her liberty, her freedom. And that means Canada is now one of 2 countries in the world with no abortion law. The anti-abortionists like to note that the other one is North Korea, but let's leave that. So Henry Morgentaler was very famous for this fight. It was in the 1980s. He got a lot of press for it. But a big part of this was all driven by his humanism and his skepticism of religion. He suffered. He was in Poland, I think, during World War II, and he was in internment camps. He was a Jew, Jewish humanist. But he, sort of took that experience and fed into his humanism. So without sort of Henry Morgentaler, there would be sort of no humanist movement. But even with all of that great groundwork, it sort of died in the 90s and early thousands with just sort of the membership that grew up with him and was very active with him just getting older and not recruiting and not refreshing. And it sort of took until the new atheist movement came out with the Dawkins, with the Hitchens, to really re-galvanize the movement. So it sort of relaunched in about 2006, 2007 with groups like mine and the Centre for Inquiry, which was founded in Toronto, Centre for Inquiry Canada, which was based off Paul Kurtz's American organization and really led by Justin Trottier, who did a lot of work for the movement in Toronto. He is about my age, but he generated a lot of controversy. A lot of people had mixed feelings about him, and so he eventually was sort of pushed to the sidelines, but he's still sort of involved in CFI Canada in some way, which has just caused a lot of internal conflict and strife and tension, but I'm not involved in it. We can gossip about it in the discussion if you really want. And then through this time, and one thing that really annoyed a lot of grassroots is CFI Canada had this idea of sort of going in and taking over these old humanist groups and sort of revitalizing them as like CFI Calgary, as CFI Vancouver, and other branches, which a lot of the old humanist groups were sort of falling down. Like the Edmonton humanist group had basically just died off. There was no group when I moved to Edmonton. There was like one name, but he was gone. So that was a necessary move, but then in some cities there were still strong groups remaining, and the group membership sort of split over whether they should be CFI or not, and it was a challenge. Meanwhile, you also had lots of skeptics in the pub groups start popping up and other similar type groups. The Skeptics in the Pub in Vancouver that I was really involved in doesn't do this kind of format. We just kind of show up at a pub, drink a bunch, and complain about whatever we feel like complaining about, whether it's homeopathy or religion or whatever, and then head off. And sometimes there's announcements about what else is upcoming in the community. But we have 3 or 4 a month in Vancouver, all around the metro, which is about 2.5 million people. And then one new group that I want to mention that started up in the last couple of years was Bad Science Watch, which was a group started by one of my friends, Jamie Williams, in Vancouver, and some of his associates, which really wanted to start going to effective action. So rather than just sort of holding a protest and then nothing actually happening, figuring out very strategically which are the ministers, which are the who do you need to talk to change health legislation to protect consumers from fraudulent claims. One huge victory they just had is Health Canada is now going to start requiring homeopathic no-sodes, which are often marketed as a vaccine alternative. It's going to have to label them as not a vaccine alternative on them. So in just a year and a half, they've already started to make some real progress on shoestring budgets like all of our groups deal with. So speaking of that, this is about the time I moved to Vancouver after I graduated in Edmonton. I wanted to move to what's affectionately known as the left coast, where it's less religious, more liberal, than Alberta, which is a very conservative province, even Edmonton. And it's warmer. It's much warmer. Edmonton would get to -30, -40 in the winter, and Vancouver snows like every other year. And it's a big deal when it snows in Vancouver. So I moved there to do graduate studies. I did more physics at Simon Fraser University. I did a master's. I didn't do a full PhD, so you can't call me doctor, you can call me master though. I got involved with the Simon Fraser University Skeptics and a whole bunch of other groups like the Vancouver Skeptics in the Pub, Centre for Inquiry Vancouver for a while, and on the board of the BC Humanist Association for a couple years. One thing that was really cool in Vancouver is there's a very activist kind of culture, and one term I'm pretty sure was actually invented there is called skepticism or skeptical activism. So the idea of getting out of the pub and start doing protests. That idea didn't necessarily originate there, but giving it a name did. So one thing the skeptical community in Vancouver did was sort of protest, when the psychic came to town, and try and hand out leaflets saying, here's what you're gonna see, it's all bunk, just so you know. It's like James Edward or other psychics, or Sylvia Brown came to town, they protested. And they did a 1023 campaign, which I know Leeds Skeptics has done, and it was based off of Merseyside, I believe, yeah. And so I got involved in all of this. The Vancouver community was growing well, it's still going well. 2 free thought bloggers came from that community. Ian Cromwell, who wrote Communist and is now quit because he's too busy being a rock star and grad student. And Natalie Reid, who also quit because of personal issues, but not because they hated free thought blogs, which is what half of people think happens. But so 2 free thought bloggers in one city for a while. I was the BCHA, BC Humanist Association's secretary for a year and then president the following year. And I really wanted to take this sort of aging humanist group and really revitalize it. And I think that's the direction that it's gone and is still going. We got involved in the Pride Parade. We did a huge march there that's grown every year. We got about 40 people in the last parade. The group does weekly meetings, which sound a bit much, especially when they're on Sunday mornings. It sounds a little churchy, but it works. It does build a stronger community where people actually care and know each other's names. It also helps we wear name tags so everyone knows everyone's names. And then while I was involved, I really saw that we had some reserve money, so I said we need to put it into someone doing the work and doing the time, because volunteers are great, but they only have finite time. So we created the executive director position. I applied for it and got it. There were other applicants, but the board chose me as the best. I'm not saying they created it for me. And someone else has taken it over since I've been gone, and it's still onward and upward. So that's sort of where I've been. Getting back to some of the current issues that are faced in Canada, Canada's still growing. Its non-religious population is huge. Like the UK, we ask a very similar useless census question, that is, what is your religion, even if you're no longer practicing? And it has that little asterisk on there. But nevertheless, in 2001, 18% of Canada said no religion. In 2011, 24% of Canada said no religion. What's really telling is Quebec is always ranked as one of the most religious provinces on the census, because 80-some% of people say they're Catholic, but no one in Quebec goes to church since the 60s. Basically, they had what they called the Quiet Revolution, where they decided all of the church's moral teachings were really bad and garbage and just not progressive for the future of Quebec. And they just stopped going to church, but they see themselves as culturally Catholic. But in British Columbia, where there isn't that really cultural religious identity, you see 44% of the province says no religion, with lots of the communities hitting above 50%. The BCHA did a little bit of our own polling on this, and we found British Columbia has about 20% say there's no God, and another 10% say maybe. So in that range, so we get about 30% atheists and agnostics versus 70% who still believe in God in some way, even if it's a spiritual higher power, which is very stereotyped of British Columbia as sort of the hippie, pot-smoking, yoga-doing, something out there crowd. So we have a growing nuns population, but we need to get them engaged. I'm happy to announce that the Sunday Assembly that's launching here in Leeds is also launching in Vancouver. And the Vancouver response has been overwhelming. They have over 200 people saying they want to go to this kind of atheist church idea, or at least check it out, which is cool. Or 250 people. We have about 75, 100 here in Leeds. And they get about 300, 400 or more a month in London. Canada has a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which was brought in the mid-80s as a way to sort of make it its own country. Up until then, Canada still technically had to pass its laws through the English Parliament or the British Parliament. And so we wanted to bring our constitution home. We still maintain the Queen as our head of state, but she's technically the Queen of Canada, so she has multiple hats. I think they're all the same crown. But she's the Queen of Canada and the Queen of Britain and the Queen of half a dozen other countries or more. But we brought across the Charter, and what it included was a lot of very progressive human rights. It doesn't officially include the separation of church and state, but it does include the freedom of conscience, which our courts have widely interpreted as separation of church and state. The problem is the religious right was just strong enough in the 80s to force the government at the time to include that Canada is founded on the supremacy, or Canada recognizes the supremacy of God, right in the preamble of our Constitution. So that's kind of been in there as a mark of shame against atheists who don't really like the supremacy of God as a concept. Similarly, our anthem says, "God keep our land." I wrote something else there. And so there's still sort of relics of religion. The free thought movement hasn't fought much against those in the last few years because it was fought a bit in the 90s and other times, not to much success. One member of parliament would stand up and say, here's a petition of 1,000 people wanting this out, and then everyone would kick him to the back bench and he would not be recognized ever again to speak. So we don't have many atheist politicians. We have some that are probably atheists, but don't really come out and say it very much. It's less of an issue here where you have an atheist deputy prime minister and an atheist leader of the opposition. We just sort of think actually the most public atheists in Canada are the Bloc Québécois party, which is the separatist party for Quebec that all of English Canada kind of hates. So we don't want to talk about them too much. But talking of them, the separatists in Quebec are the government right now in a minority situation. Canada likes bringing in minority governments but not forming coalitions, so they just struggle along until it breaks down and they have another election. You apparently, we didn't get a majority, let's make a coalition, or else we can't do anything. You can learn from Canada, have lots of elections, they're fun. Quebec's minority government, which is a separatist government, brought in what's called the Charter of Values, which was during the election promised to be a charter of secularism, which sounds awesome. Who doesn't want a charter of secularism that says this is a secular province? The problem is this was sort of brought in the French style of laïcité, or the French secularism. So it's very similar to what France is doing, where they're saying religious symbols must be banned in public or else it doesn't look like it's a secular state. So the one in Quebec isn't as drastic as the examples going on in France, but what they are trying to do is saying all public servants must remove all religious symbols while they're working. Except it's not really all religious symbols, it's just the big ones minorities tend to wear. So if you wear a little cross, that's okay. Or if you have Islamic earrings, if that's a thing, that's okay. Or if what was the Jewish example? A little Star of David, if it's just a little pendant, that's okay. But if you wear a kippah or a headscarf or a turban, or basically what some of them feel they have to wear, that's banned in the public service and will be banned in the public service. And so most of English Canada is pretty against this. We value multiculturalism. We like the idea of incorporating minority cultures and letting people celebrate their own religion, so long as it doesn't push on other people or infringe on other rights. But there's some tension. There are some atheists who are very ban all the religious symbols because it's got to get out of everywhere. It's a debate we can have. And finally, what I'll talk about is the New York Times just yesterday published an editorial talking about how Canada's Prime Minister is worse than George W. Bush at muzzling scientists. And this is something that's sort of been going on for a number of years that the Skeptics movement has definitely been aware of, that scientists in Canada have noticed under our Conservative government increasing pressure to not talk about climate change, to not talk about environmentalism, to not oppose resource extraction. Evolution seems okay, but our Minister of State for Science and Technology for a long time was a creationist chiropractor. Think about it. And so that's kind of the realm we're dealing with. The Prime Minister of Canada, Stephen Harper, is about as inspiring as David Cameron. They're both pretty milquetoast bland, but Harper is a evangelical Christian Missionary Alliance, which he doesn't talk about much, but is very sort of conservative kind of church, very right wing. But luckily he sort of keeps that down. He hasn't brought up abortion, to his credit. He has sort of left gay marriage since he got in. He had one vote on it. Potentially he even rushed the vote so the religious right couldn't have time to build up a strong opposition to gay marriage in Canada. But he has done things like muzzling scientists and cutting science funding and sort of redirecting it towards more industry science, like this science has to do something right away that makes money. And that concerns science enthusiasts who like the idea of just doing pure research for the sake of doing pure research. And so that's where Canada's at. We're a big, diverse country, having lots of debates that go on everywhere else. And I open this up to lots of discussion because I'm here. And we have another Canadian here who can back me up or rebut everything I said. Or just not talk because I don't want to force people to talk. Thanks. I hope that was long enough. Questions? Strange questions? Or
do people want to go to the bar first?
Repeat answers.
Then we'll go straight to questions.
Yes.
Is religion a problem, would you say, in Canada today? Because I'm just thinking about the issue of truth on the one hand and the issue of sort of tolerance and freedom on the other hand. Because you could argue that and some of the things you discussed were sort of standing up for truth against superstition. You mentioned psychics.
Right.
And some of the things you mentioned were standing up for the freedom of expression, freedom of conscience against intolerance. But just leaving aside the sort of truth and superstition, because I think everyone in this room can accept that even if there isn't a God, you can't prove that there is one. There doesn't seem to be much intolerance against atheists. There does seem to be a lot of religious tolerance. So, and all examples I can think of about intolerance are really directed towards people who are maybe racist, homophobic, or sexist. So, in terms of tolerance, do we
like Britain, Canada is a pretty private about your religion country. We sort of keep it to you keep it to yourself. You don't talk about religion and politics in polite company, right? And that's a big thing in Canada is everyone sort of has their religion and doesn't really bring it out in public. I think it's becoming an issue in certain areas, like Quebec. They view minority religions as a threat. They view Islam as a threat. Some people, not all. But in other places, it's pretty fine. Vancouver is a very non-religious city. Like it's 50 to 70% no religion in the city of Vancouver. Like it's a bastion of liberalism. But that's why the issues there have to do more with woo, because it's a very big yoga, like alternative, no GMO lifestyle kind of place where you have to fight a lot of anti-green science or anti-science green attitudes. There are green science attitudes, but there's a lot of anti-science green stuff in Vancouver, environmental stuff. Other parts of Canada have lots of religion that is trying to push. One thing I didn't talk about in Alberta is they brought in, Alberta for a long time has had a tough relationship with LGBT rights, and it wasn't officially written into the Human Rights Act until about 2009, 2010 in Alberta that sexual orientation should not be discriminated on, but it was read in by statute by the courts before that, and they told the government, you need to add this because you shouldn't be discriminating someone because they're gay. And they said, well, whatever. But so they eventually brought it in with a bill to reform the Human Rights Act. But what they did to appease the religious right is they added something called parental rights. So they gave parents the option to opt their children out of school classes that offended their religious sensibilities. And when asked about this, does that mean they can take their kids out of evolution? The first minister was like, oh yeah, sure. And they sort of backtracked on that as soon as they realized that was a stupid thing to say, because Canada's still a mostly pro-evolution country, except parts of Alberta. There's that sort of tension in parts of Alberta where there are sort of strong religious attitudes. And there's still a lot of religious privilege in Canada. We have the religiously funded public schools. Alberta actually also, I forgot to mention, has its independent school system, which is a charter school system that your Minister of Education is really fond of, because he likes the idea of just throwing money at private companies to do education, as though that'll solve many problems that I could already name from my wife's experience in the education system here. It won't. But what that does is it means that money goes to private institutions that can be religious. So Alberta is funding a number of Alberta and British Columbia are both funding a number of conservative religious education schools for children. And because they're pluralistic, they'll include Islamic schools, they'll include Jewish schools, and they have to teach the curriculum, but if they teach beyond the curriculum, if they teach evolution but then say, but there's also this creation stuff, they could probably get away with it and still get state funding. So there are fights, and it's such a big country that there's like different fights being fought everywhere. Does that answer your question at all?
Well, my question really is, are you reacting against intolerance? But your examples, it seems to be that the atheists are more intolerant than their
I think atheists
than religion. And just your example you gave me, I mean, you can sort of debate the rights and wrongs of it, but if parents choose not to have their children go to a class that they don't like, you could argue that's the rights of parents, and it's an intolerant attitude to force parents to send their children to a particular class.
There was one thing Quebec did do that I'm really appreciative of, is they instituted a mandatory every year of education religious and secular ethics course. So every year they have to learn about world religions and secular ethics and philosophies. Every student had to learn about this in the public system. If you go to a private system, you can do whatever you want. Some Catholic parents were very offended by this. They said, I didn't want my child to learn about other things, about the rest of the world. And they sued the government, and they took it to court, and they lost. The court said, you do not have the right to keep your children ignorant. And so that's sort of where it's come to in Canada. If you're asking, is there sort of discrimination against atheists, I would say it's not bad, but there's still, there's not atheist politicians I can really point to as key representatives. I can point to lots of Catholics, I can point to lots of Jewish and Muslims and Sikhs, not lots of Muslims and Sikhs, but a few, but I can't really point to atheists in Parliament in Canada. So there's still like a lack of representation and still work to be done for atheists, I think.
Are religious people more tolerant of atheists than, say, in the USA? Something like George Bush once said that he didn't consider atheists to be US citizens. He actually said that.
It varies widely, but I would say on the whole, yes.
Right.
You'll have more extremes on both sides. Like there are very liberal people in the US who are very...
So I'm sure the percentage of people who actually are atheists in the US is far higher than what you get in polls, because people, like you say,
it depends how you ask the question.
Don't admit to it.
Well, yeah, and it all depends how you ask the question. The census question says, "What is your religion?" Even if you don't practice, which is kind of meaningless. But then, if you ask someone, "Are you religious?" you get one number. And if you ask, "Do you believe in God?" you get a different number. So they're really
Because I know many people who put the religion were Christian and they don't go to church. They're not Christian. They're not practicing Christians, but they put it.
If you could bring across one campaign from Canada to run in the UK, what would it be? And what do you think Canada's doing well that the UK could be?
I like what Bad Science Watch is doing, and it's specific. It doesn't do a lot of stuff you see, so it doesn't generate that grassroots press and that sort of excitement among the groups that bring people to pubs, that bring people to events. But it does change policy, and it is sort of the strategy I think we need to more take in the long term. I'm not saying the UK doesn't do that. I think there are a couple organizations, and it's called Bad Science because of Ben Goldacre, I believe, and British Skeptics. So I won't say that you're not doing it. It does call itself Bad Science Watch because it tries to not call itself a skeptic organization. It's a consumer advocacy and pro-science organization, which it's framed for obvious certain reasons that may be obvious, but I like that one.
Do you think the climate, the actual weather, has
Like-
a lot to do with the Canadian mentality?
Like it's very non-religious in the Nordic countries and Canada for the same reason. Like
No,
religious people can't take the cold.
No, I seriously, my family are either they go for extremes.
Right.
So my family live sort of Toronto, sort of that sort of mid area,
Central
and I've spent a
University.
lot of time like in Toronto and out towards sort of into Ontario, into like
Right.
Kitchener County and stuff like that. And I find that you either drink a lot or you don't drink at all. You either are very religious or you're not religious at all. So I wonder if the weather has something to do with it.
I don't know.
Because it's
yeah.
it's cold for a
Yeah.
very long period
Yeah,
of
that's
time,
very true.
and then it's very warm for for
Very
a reasonably period of time.
Yeah.
But
It's not very
it gets hot.
Yeah.
You
It's
know.
pretty warm compared to
Some parts are.
you haven't experienced British summer yet.
That's true. Is there such a thing?
We call it
Skeptical.
Really?
I view Canada more as sort of the average of Europe and US and sort of almost everything. So it's similar to the UK but a little bit more to the US. So take their health policy and sort of average it out. We're closer to Europe in health policy because that's an extreme in the US. But take any policy, we have about half the tax rate, or anything. And I think that's sort of
Weird tax system. Anyway.
yeah. So we get this sort of weird. We're kind of like the U.S. in that we have some religious extremes, but then we're kind of like the very secular parts of Europe where we have very good, strong atheism. So I think it's that sort of mix, that averaging, that mixed market economy as they like to talk about it when
So
it's growing up.
are there
That sort of gives you a quasi-religious state. It's not it's not as religious as the U.S., but it's not as atheistic as say Northern Europe.
Yeah. So are the Amish?
Atmosphere.
Are they?
They're bigger in the U.S., but there are sort of Hutterites and Mennonites that came over. But I can't say I know enough about that. I knew a few Mennonite colonies when I was growing up because there are some in southern Alberta.
Kitchener in Ontario.
I can't tell if they're more just like cultural and they stay together because it's just sort of a family.
Do they have somebody in the government in that province that looks after their education? Because I don't know, because they wouldn't have a.
I'm not sure.
I don't think in the UK they would have someone that would look after their cultural, educational upbringing.
I think they would be okay to open their private school
Yeah.
in Canada, and in certain provinces they could probably make it an independent school that would get some state funding.
There's lots of homeschooling as well.
Yeah, homeschooling as
'Cause
well.
You've got a lot
Which
of
gets
mothers who
supported.
don't tend to work and tend
Yeah.
to stay home and take care of the kids, so you get a lot of homeschooling.
Yeah.
There's a big cultural difference between Canada and Alaska.
I can't speak about Alaska. We don't have Sarah Palin, so there's that
There's
going for us.
like Alaska more American or Canada.
Alaska's probably way more American. There's like one road that sometimes is open between Canada and Alaska. Alaska's like here, and most of Canada is right along the border in terms of people. Like most 90% of Canadians live within something like an hour drive of the US. So there's no one in northern Canada. About 1 million people live north of.
So it's just like Canadians, Canada, Alaska.
Yeah, Alaska's the US, but cold.
I always think of culture as more geographical rather than actual like political.
Yeah, Canada's a very big country. It's like the size of Europe.
Big.
But empty, because there's only 35 million people. 350 million.
You obviously get different sort of religious groups in different provinces, because
Yeah.
obviously Nova Scotia will be Presbyterian because it's
Yeah, The East Coast is very sort of traditional Protestant,
Mm.
and by the East Coast I mean Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, PEI, New Brunswick. I'm drinking and I'm sick. So those four are pretty Protestant. They're actually pretty conservative about it, just because it's been their culture for so long, and it's kind of a small village mentality.
Mm.
You know, there's about 1.5 million, 2 million people in all four of those provinces. Or I might be underestimating, but it's not that many people in those four islands. Quebec is Catholic because of the history of Quebec with France, but it's very similar to France in that it's rejected that sort of Vatican rule, but it still sort of retains it for cultural, and it retains it a lot just to differentiate from English Canada, which was always sort of Protestant, Church of England, or otherwise. Ontario, similarly, is sort of nominally Church of England, but mostly gone, or just Anglican. The prairies have a lot of, Eastern European immigrants, German immigrants, so very mix of Protestant, different views, but a lot of immigration to Canada. Canada accepts more immigrants than almost anywhere else in the world, so the mayor of Calgary is Muslim, an Ismaili Muslim, who's also probably the most popular politician in Canada right now, because he doesn't wear his faith on his sleeve, but he does do a lot of social media. And Calgary had a huge crisis during the summer of a flood, and he was everywhere. It seemed like he didn't sleep. He was tweeting and saving lives at the same time. So the man is indestructible, and he's going into an election right now, and people are asking why are others running against him. So, and he's a progressive sort of green type guy, so seems like he'll do good for a city that's had way too much urban sprawl. British Columbia is sort of a mix of sort of a conservative Protestant interior, but then a lot of Asian immigration, sort of Chinese, Japanese immigration, which brings, and South Asian immigration. So there's a lot of Sikhs in sort of Surrey and just outside of the city of Vancouver, but still in Metro Vancouver, and lots of different religions mixing around, so it makes an interesting mix. And then the Chinese bring sort of either the Christianity that's been imported to China over the years, and a lot of no religion or just sort of ancestor worship and other kind of belief systems, and so it's just a huge mix, and some Buddhism and everything in BC. So it's a diverse, big, sprawling country.
All along the border.
Yeah, mostly. Edmonton is actually the one exception. It's it's the one city over 1 million that's not that close. And I've been up to Yellowknife, and it's 18,000 people in the Northwest Territories is the capital. It's a very small town and has very little dark in the summer. I don't recommend going in the winter. And don't leave the town in the summer because you get eaten by mosquitoes.
I've been eaten by a few mosquitoes.
This was spraying DEET to chase them away as we ran to a waterfall and ran back. We're like, this is the worst idea ever. Go ahead again.
Another question. You mentioned that an increasing number of people are identifying themselves as atheists, and the number of people
As no religion, technically.
no religion, and then, so the number of people identifying themselves as religious is decreasing.
Yeah.
Do you see that as a cause of celebration, as a positive sign, and if so, why?
I see it as, I'm non-religious and I like it when other people agree with me, in a selfish sense. I do see religion as causing slightly more harm than good in the world, especially very strident versions and Protestant versions, or not Protestant, sorry, fundamentalist versions. And I don't see that same tendency in a liberal, democratic, non-religious country.
Okay, I've got a
Atheists can cause trouble, but not generally in a liberal, democratic one.
I've got a following question. Do you think multiculturalism is a good idea?
Yes.
Because you mentioned that there are people who identify themselves as cultural Catholics. Now, if you think
Right.
religion is a bad thing that people identify themselves as religious, but it's a good thing that we have multiculturalism. How do you square those two?
I'm not going to force anyone to identify in any way. So I'm really happy if people want to identify as religious. I would, prefer that if they don't go to church and they don't really believe in God and they don't agree with the church they're claiming to be, that they stop identifying as it, because it sounds a little hypocritical, but I'm not going to tell them you can't. So I like the approach Canada's taken to multiculturalism because it really tries to include people rather than exclude people. I think there's a lot of danger in sort of ghettoizing communities, and where I think Europe sort of fails at multiculturalism is that it calls itself multicultural because there's a lot of immigration, but then, you know, there's a Muslim district, and then there's a Sikh district, and then there's, you know, the district from this country, and then there's the African district, and they don't talk to each other. I think there's a lot of learning that can be done in sort of multicultural center, you know, when you get people of different backgrounds and ethnicities and cultural and religious identities, you know, so that interfaith or whatever discussions going on, we can learn a lot and we can tolerate and we can reduce tensions. Threats I see are when people view other parts of the community as threats, when they're just people trying to make a living, pay the bills, raise their kids. We don't have to agree on everything. Like if someone wants to be fundamentalist Muslim, as long as they don't want to threaten the separation of church and state and don't threaten violence, fine, they can do that. I would prefer they not be, but I'm not going to force that on them. And that's how I approach it, if that makes sense.
Do you think faith schools are an issue with that? Like,
I generally don't like the idea of faith schools because they section people off.
right,
And I think it's better to have that mix.
I guess you see the
And it creates tensions, and you have to approach it sort of.
I don't agree with this. at all.
Sorry, go ahead.
someone as
I
the,
think education and religion should be totally separate.
you see the person with a different faith as the person over there rather than the person sitting next to you in maths or something. Like,
Yeah, I mean, I
that's-
think some practice Islam at home if they want, but I don't think they should be an Islamic school,
No.
for example. I don't agree with this.
So the challenge then comes when people with strong religious faith who say, my child has to pray 5 times a day,
Yeah.
then needs to be accommodated within the school, or else they're going to get excluded. And that's where tensions lie. And I think making black and white lines in the sand, like France and Quebec are trying to do, are bad for that reason. Because I think it's better to do a little bit of accommodating, and it frustrates us all a little bit, but we can deal with that tension and then all learn a little bit more, and hopefully no one gets extremized and wants to blow shit up, to be frank. Let's all just be friends.
Do you not see any potential in the future for any sort of race violence?
There's always tension, and there has been in Canada in the past, and there will be in the future. You know, Canada put Japanese people in internment camps during World War II. Canada has what it calls the Indian Act, which is basically just a racist piece of legislation from the 19th century, saying that, you know, the people who were there first have to deal with all this shit. And that's Canada's worst part. But going forward, you know, there's always tension, and it's tough
You were saying
resolve it.
there's going to be, or there is, and there is still
Yeah.
obviously a lot of immigration into Canada.
Yeah.
It's been probably one of the least populated countries
Yeah.
on this
Well, I
planet.
mean, all the immigration tends to go to the cities too,
Yeah.
because that's where jobs tend to be. So the immigration is going to Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, and it creates tension if it's not sort of integrated well. And you need, you know, people can't bring all of their customs over because some customs don't work with a liberal democracy. But, you know, you want to let people try to express their whatever they want to express, so long as it doesn't hurt others.
I mean,
And so it's a lot of just
I-
like trying to make people learn.
I couldn't imagine any Canadians getting into a race riots. Honestly. I mean, I can't
There,
imagine.
there's not quite race
like there
riots,
would
but
be in the
people-
UK that
people
essentially
desecrate.
sparking fights
Yeah,
and things.
people desecrate churches every once in a while, or
Yeah.
like a mosque or something will get like Nazis. Like there are radicals in
Yeah.
Canada who do racist shit.
There's
And-
also barricades, and the First Nations have done a lot of standoffs.
Mm.
And there was a big case, actually, the Chief Teresa, what's her face? She hit the BBC.
Yeah, I don't know more.
Yeah. She hit the BBC last Christmas. She went on a hunger strike as
Yeah.
chief of one of the First Nations.
Atawapiska.
Yeah, which is basically living in third world conditions.
Mm.
So she was trying to get attention to the kind of plight of her
Challenges of it.
people. So she went on a hunger strike for
Spence.
Trees expense, yeah.
days, 2 months almost.
Yeah. Makes you just survived on the water and
Fish
But
broth.
they
Oh.
do get quite, I would say they do get quite desperate, and they can put up blockades around, key routes and things like that, but they're so marginalized in the area that they're in northern communities and they're quite
Yeah.
small, so you don't
it's hard to make an
hear
impact
about it,
when
and
you're
it's not
300 kilometers.
When we had the riots in the UK, I mean, every other phone call was from a relative
Right.
in Canada going,
Well, and this is where the stereotypes persist, because
Yeah.
the last riot I can think of in Canada was in Vancouver when we lost the Stanley Cup, the hockey tournament. And it was actually because we didn't win hockey that people rioted.
Yeah.
Actually, I think if people won, they still would have rioted. It was just poorly designed and like
It's-
too many drunks were in one spot at one
Yeah, but you
time.
go to baseball games and you can drink beer and you know.
But an interesting thing is, I mean, perhaps a more recent riot than that was the G20 protests.
Yeah, there's
So there's a big political movement.
Yeah.
And I think it's a big left-right political movement,
yeah.
which it almost surpasses the religious versus secular argument. There's this conflict between political ideologies, and especially a resurgence really in the left, which is lots of anti-globalization.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, Canada's politics is very sort of similar to the UK. We have sort of two main parties that have been dueling back and forth for a long time. UK, you have the Labour and Conservatives. Canada had the Liberals and the Conservatives, but the Liberals sort of blew their power in the 90s, and at the end of it were way too corrupt that no one accepted them anymore. So Canada sort of started voting for the NDP, which is the New Democratic Party, which is really about it's where the Labour would have been before Blair. So before he brought it to the right and made it sort of what Canada's Liberal Party is now. And the Conservatives are about the same. So UK went like that. Canada, I mean, even our NDP sort of brought into the center, because you can't be a radical leftist and get elected in Canada or the UK these days. Which is maybe good if you're conservative, maybe bad. Hopefully you can't be a radical BNP member. Although, looking at who the MEPs are for this district, I was not happy. Not proud, that's the word to use.
So what
Nothing
do you,
against UK.
what do you see as the big challenges going forward for Canada?
The Charter of Values in Quebec until it either dies from that government going to election or otherwise, I think there's that big tension between that sort of French approach to secularism, which is get religion out of everything. Put religion at home, but if you bring it out in public, we're going to throw you in jail, which seems a bit excessive. Well, it's not, that's straw manning what they're doing in Quebec, but I think that's sort of the current issue that Canada is dealing with as a whole, and mostly in Quebec, versus sort of the English, rest of Canada kind of approach to secularism of multiculturalism and live and let live, and Canada even calls it, accommodation, religious accommodation or whatever, where you have to wear your police hat, but if you religiously are required to wear a turban, that's fine. You're still wearing a uniform, people still know you're a cop, but you're wearing a turban, so it's cool, don't worry about it. And I think that's sort of the tension in Canada right now, is sort of that French approach versus the English approach. And my bet's on the English approach winning, but the French like complaining in Canada. It's a national pastime, which is historically justified. But otherwise, lots of little battles in terms of like Gideon Bibles in schools in BC, the sort of funding of religious faith schools. In terms of skepticism, there's the same kind of things going on here. There's growing recognition of homeopaths and naturopaths as licensed doctors when they don't go to medical school. There's, that air of legitimacy to it.
Did you say faith schools were a problem for like segregation and people sort of mixing and coming
I
together?
think it is an issue because it does sort of cordon people off into, you stick with like-minded and you don't get that interaction with peers of different backgrounds and different beliefs.
But you wouldn't say that Catholic schools have segregated Catholics. They seem to be well integrated, and yet so it's used against Muslims. And I'm just wondering whether faith schools aren't being scapegoated for the absence of integration, because the absence of integration preceded faith schools. I went to a predominantly Asian school in Keighley. There's predominantly Asian areas that go to state schools, which are basically Asian-only schools.
Right.
So it doesn't seem like faith schools are the cause of segregation and the absence of
We
integration.
don't have as strong of almost those ethnic, not ghetto, but ethnic communities in Canada. A lot of communities are more diverse these days in Canada. There's not like the Asian area or the white area. I mean, in some communities there definitely are areas that are more Asian than white, but it's not like you're in an Asian community. If you're white, why are you here? So the faith school does pose a challenge in that area if all the South Asians are attending Islamic school versus everyone else is sort of attending the public schools or state schools. And that's where I think the challenge lies. The Catholic system I view as both redundant because they're publicly funding 2 full school boards in a number of provinces, and just the United Nations has declared it discriminatory. Why are they fully funding a Catholic system but not either all religions get a full funded system or just one system? It's the only really 2 options I see to approach that justifiably. Like the United Nations has condemned the province of Ontario 2 or 3 times, saying don't do this, and they're like, But we don't want to. Actually, one Conservative brought it up in an Ontario election and said, okay, we recognize that having a Catholic system and a secular system is unfair, so we're going to allow anyone who wants to open a faith school to do it. And the province freaked out. They're like, why would you're going to fund Muslim schools, they'll be terrorists. And it's like, you're opposing it for the wrong reasons. But
So in Canada, do you not have sort of racial segregation? Because I know America's quite segregated, like Harlem's like a black-only area. Do you not have like black-only areas in Canada?
we don't have many blacks in Canada. But we do have, like in Vancouver, the city of Vancouver is pretty mixed. There's definitely a slightly more Chinese area of the city of Vancouver. Richmond, that's just south of Vancouver and connected. Because Vancouver's a metro area with multiple cities, all like, you don't notice the change. Richmond's known as more Chinese, Asian than Vancouver, but there's still, white people, South Asians, other people living there. So I don't feel it's as segregated as the US. And racial discrimination exists in Canada, especially against the First Nations, who suffer the most of it, but it's not as bad as the US. Not that that's the bar we should aim for.
It'd be interesting if there's any data on there's a school that was set up in Toronto a few years ago now that's all black.
Right.
It was controversial at the time because people were saying you're imposing these boundaries and you're segregating people, and that's not the way to integrate or to heal communities. And they were saying that it's important for them, I think, as a community to teach more black history and kind of integrate that into other areas of the curriculum. And I think it's been running for a few years, so it would actually be interesting if there's any actual data on how that's been working.
How those students have done versus students of a similar background in neighboring public schools.
I would say I feel like there are still immigrant communities do still tend to gravitate towards, you have your Chinatown, and you have your kind of.
Well, I know Vancouver's Chinatown doesn't really have Chinese people living in it anymore. It's more historically Chinatown because it's right off downtown, so it's near the downtown east side, which is sort of famous for being Canada's most poverty-stricken area. But most Chinese people live in South Vancouver or Richmond. They're actually doing quite well, so they don't really want to live in the poverty area of Vancouver. But I mean, there's still Chinese shops there, and there's still the Chinese heritage there, so some people do, or at least they commute in to run their shop. I mean, the area of Vancouver I lived in, especially just west of there, used to be a really Greek area. A lot of Greek immigration flowed there right after the fascists were in charge of Greece, and especially after the collapse, and so there's still like Greek days and everything, but I don't get the sense outside of that there's really a Greek community in that area. It's more like students who just commute over to the university that's nearby. But other parts of Canada are definitely different. It's a big country, as I mentioned. But it's trying. I know in school, we did a lot of, when I did education in the public system in the 90s, there was a lot of talk of multiculturalism. And really I think they really started to revamp the curriculum by this point, because they had since the 80s, to start to talk about different perspectives. And we started talking about, you know, what Canada did during World War II to the Japanese, and started to think about, you know, what other cultures were doing. And that's, I think, really important to, you know, not just think about, well, here's the list of English settlers and explorers that came and settled Canada, and here's the list of French ones, memorize them and write them on the test, because that doesn't give a full picture. I mean, there's still lots to be done in Canada's education system to teach a full perspective, because history is complicated and written by the victors. Was this informative? Was this a useful Skeptics in the Pub for everyone?
What would you say is the main threat in terms of intolerance in Canada today?
Islamophobia. If that doesn't set off a powder keg. I don't think it's huge, but I think there's definitely that sort of fear of too many immigrants of the wrong kind. And it's not that all Canadians are fine with multiculturalism. They're not. Many say it's failed, or there's too many immigrants of this kind, or, you know, we need to get our own house in order first before we let more in, or whatever. And there's always those kind of attitudes. I'm sure you hear them here too. And it's not that that Islam gets a clean slate in my mind. It's just that automatically assuming someone who is Muslim is someone who shouldn't come to Canada is clearly wrong.
Isn't it also people are
That's
often unable to tell the difference between Asian people and Islamic people? Like
See, the challenge for me is Vancouver, Asian means Chinese. And I don't mean predominant, like most people who come from Asia to Canada are Chinese or Japanese. So when we talk about Asians in Canada, we're talking about a different demographic than here that I've learned. So when people talk about Asians here, they're talking about South Asians, about Pakistan, Malaysia, or Indonesia. There's far less Chinese, Japanese immigration, South Korean immigration to the UK than there is to Canada. So Vancouver actually has Canada's largest Iranian population. And most of the Iranians I actually meet are hardcore atheists because they got out. And all justice to them. They can be as hardcore anti-religious as they want. They've seen like one of the worst regimes that I think exists. So yeah, if you wanna like hate everything about religion, that's fine. I don't hate it as much. I'm helping with the Sunday assembly stuff. I find there's some value in, you know, getting together and singing songs and having fun. I went to a weekly humanist meeting. Don't get more religious than that. Well, you do, but it's a cult. Weekly meetings aren't a bad idea. But other threats to tolerance in Canada. I mean, there's just a lot of historical racism towards the First Nations in Canada. Because their communities are so impoverished, they're viewed very negatively. They're viewed as lazy, they're viewed as drunks, but there is huge alcoholism problems, there's huge crime problems because there's no jobs on the reserves. So it's sort of like it's analogous but not perfect, because no analogy is perfect, to the situation faced in towns like Barnsley where there are no jobs. And so people are on systematic welfare. And so their children don't care about school. And so they just sort of like decline, but they need to get jobs, but there's no jobs there, and they don't want to leave because that's where they've always been. And in Canada, it's especially bad with the sort of reserve system that I wouldn't say should just be abolished, but we need to fix a lot of things, and a lot of it should be here, listening to what those people want. But I think that's sort of the biggest intolerance in Canada is towards the First Nations.
But that's more a problem of poverty, isn't it? I mean, in terms of freedom of conscience and freedom of speech, are there certain views that are simply unacceptable in Canada? Are there certain things that are said that aren't allowed to be said? I mean, are there laws against speech? Are there speech
Yes.
regulations?
So Canada does have hate speech laws, but our charter protects freedom of speech. So our charter protects 4 fundamental freedoms: speech, association, press goes under speech, speech, association, conscience, and what else goes in there? Conscience includes religion. It doesn't actually explicitly say religion. I think press, but press I think in speech. But basically, there's other parts of the Constitution or the Charter, which is sort of our supreme law. Basically, all of our laws have to measure up to that law, which is something Britain doesn't have. So our courts can strike down laws that don't fit within this supreme law. It's the rule. It's our rule of law. But we have other things that sort of protect security of persons. So you're allowed to live a good, safe life. You know, you're allowed to be what you want to be, and people can't threaten you. And then there's other, protection of minority language rights, and there's protection from unjust police brutality. So we have freedom of speech, but it's also the first clause of our charter is all within reason. So the government can pass reasonable laws to sort of restrict any of these things, but they have to be justifiable. You can't just ban something because they want to ban it. So what the courts have consistently found in Canada is that hate speech is that kind of speech that's not really meant to move an argument forward, but is meant to sort of discriminate against a certain class of people. So if you go and publish, I'll give you an example from one that was recently prosecuted. If you publish a series of pamphlets that say homosexual teachers will rape your kid or molest your children, and then you put it in everyone's mailbox, you will be charged of hate speech, or one person was, because he drew an overly broad conclusion that was meant to make people more afraid of the gay community based on no reasonable grounds. And so there is hate speech laws in Canada, but they're meant to sort of prevent people from overly discriminating. You can still argue whether or not gay marriage should be a thing, but you have to do it in a way that doesn't, destroy an entire community or attack. And the same with attacking religion, but generally those communities that are in positions of privilege are better insulated from they're less likely to feel persecuted than those that have been persecuted. The black community is more likely to feel the effects of racism than the white community, just in most countries. Does that make sense? I hope it does. So that's Canada's one. And then there's libel laws and other things, and I don't know exactly how Canada's libel laws stand up versus the UK's, and they've recently changed here because of Simon saying, I think.
Yep.
I think ours are still a little old school. For a long time in Canada, you could download songs but not upload them. They changed that though. So we had some old copyright laws. And then we made them way too restrictive because we have conservative government. But
Was
that's
that pamphlet case the one just in February at the Supreme Court?
Bill Whatcott, yeah. He ran for mayor of Edmonton on multiple occasions. Somehow he lost.
Yeah, the hate speech laws have been controversial in recent years, and part of the problem is because a lot of them have been tried in these human rights courts, which are slightly different.
Yeah.
And also
So each province
sort
sort of established what's called a human rights tribunal,
yeah.
which is basically a way, like the court system is expensive. If you want to sue someone for libel or whatever, you have to have a lot of money to actually put it forward and hire lawyers and do everything professionally. So Canada set up what's called human rights tribunals, which in general are set up to protect, if you lose your job because you're gay, or you get kicked out of your house because you're black, or whatever, offense to human rights. And so in those human rights tribunals, you can represent yourself, and they will let you go in for free. There's no sort of bar. And you can raise your complaint, and if they find it's valid, they will call in the defendant, the person you're accusing, and sort of, mediate it, and then decide on whether there's repayment to be done. So there's no court conviction out of it, but they can fine people for being, discriminating on things. And what rose a lot of controversy in Canada was adding hate speech to this, so that if you felt persecuted by something someone else said, then you could sort of go to this tribunal and ask them to bring them and say you felt persecuted by what they said. A couple cases have been tried. In my opinion, when you look closely at how they sort of approach it, it is generally justified, and it follows a chain of logic that those actions were beyond the scope of the law. The courts have scaled it back a little from its initial, overly broad hate speech restriction. But you'll get one kind of case is someone publishes a magazine article, I think he republished the infamous Danish cartoons with the turban explode head bomb, and also wrote a article questioning whether Muslim immigration would overrun Canada in sort of an inflammatory way. And he got tried. I think he won though in the end, but this was a guy who likes to be a martyr for free speech. So he makes a lot of noise during it and tried to make a mockery of the whole thing, calling it a banana court, even though it exists for a legitimate purpose, which is, if you get kicked out of your house or kicked out of your job for discriminatory reasons. But in other cases, it's, I haven't seen an example that is a gross injustice, in my opinion. There are ones people like to cite, but when I read the decisions, they're not poorly thought out.
I mean, the reason I asked that question, because it goes back to my first question, is why are you a sort of militant atheist or an activist atheist? Is it because of you see religion as a threat to tolerance and freedom? But the examples that you've given...
I just see it as wrong. I don't see it as true. So I don't call myself militant. I'm an activist because I want to make sure that atheism, or that religion isn't privileged over non-religion, because I don't believe that we should be funding religious schools if we're not funding atheist schools, and I don't really want to see atheist schools funded because I don't want to segregate everyone off into their ideological camps. I want that discussion to happen, ideally in a secular school where children are allowed to believe whatever they want. The school doesn't force them to believe anything. So there's no Lord's Prayer, but they can have a discussion about theology as long as the teacher isn't pushing something. And that can be hard to do, but that's the challenge of being multicultural. But I do care about what I think is true, and I don't think there is a God. I think there's not enough evidence for people to believe in it, and I think there are a lot of harms of dogmatism and fundamentalism that I want to make aware. That's where I come from. I'm fine if people disagree, but I will argue once in a while. Sometimes I get tired of arguing and I just want to go off and drink, but I hope I sound consistent. And I'm sick, so don't rock me too hard.
Any other questions? Okay. Well, I'm sure you'll all join me in thanking Ian for a fascinating talk.